All right, well, we're just about 5 past, so I think we can get started. Thank you, everybody, for attending today's IGRI Research Seminar. Really great to see everybody after a summer off from seminars, and we're looking forward to a great year of talks and presentations by people in our network here. And we're really delighted to have presenting today Thomas Skuzinski and Kate Albrecht, Jason Michnick and Carolina Velandia Hernandez, are also part of this research team. And I'm not sure if Jason, you're also presenting, but it would be great to hear from the whole team here. The paper they're going to be presenting is called Infrastructure Governance and Institutional Grammar, a conceptual framework and application to drinking water systems in Chicagoland. So thank you so much for being our presenters today. Whenever you're ready, please feel free to go ahead.
And Saba, the only thing you might need to do is enable screen sharing. I had thought it was already enabled.
Yep, you should be good to go now. Thank you, Thomas.
Yep. So, all right, and I'll go ahead and get this into presenter view. And then Kate is actually leading us off, and then we'll turn it over to me.
Tom, do you mind just swapping the view so it's just the one slide for the screen share?
Yeah, hold on. Is that better? Is that working for you, Kate?
I still just see the PowerPoint, but it's all good. We can make it work as we go. It's like the whole PowerPoint. But no worries. I just want to say, first of all, thank you to Saba and all those who work really hard to organize these seminars. I know our team and myself specifically has really learned a lot through some of these past seminars. So we welcome this opportunity for feedback. So the research we're going to be presenting was a combined effort between Northern Illinois University and University of Illinois Chicago. I also want to recognize one of my other colleagues who's here with us, Mike Siciliano, who has really given us a lot of support on this research. And we are funded through the Illinois Innovation Network. And so this was a one-year project to kind of get started in understanding infrastructure governance. And so one of the things that really is important to us is sort of framing sort of what we're looking for also for feedback, because this is research that's very much in the works. So we welcome your feedback. We welcome also just insights from your own work. So if you can switch to the next slide, Tom. Great. So so in the study that we're going to be presenting, we are really focusing on the constitutive aspects of IG 2.0 and recognizing that, at least in the published examples, there's a little bit more of an emphasis or usage of the regulative coding frameworks. And so we would really welcome your feedback around sort of thinking from the constitutive perspective. And we are utilizing data that was generated from semi-structured interviews. And so, building on some past work, especially the Watkins and Westphal piece that really talks about do people talk in institutional statements and how to think about the way that individuals express their their views and perceptions of pieces of institutionalism and institutional logics and grammar, and also sort of building on this kind of inspiration that we thought was really important, right? One of the biggest things is that in an inter-organizational space, which this research is going to cover, because governance of drinking water is inherently going to have engagements between municipalities, that this inter-organizational space is not always written down, right? It's not always codified specifically in a plan or even in regulations. So just to give you, not a spoiler alert, but a little bit of one, there really isn't a very structured regulatory environment in which our research is taking place, which for some people, they're like, how can you not regulate drinking water? Well, Tom's going to tell you about that and what has sort of transpired in this world of polycentricity. So we'd love feedback throughout as you listen to this presentation and share with us kind of your thinking, because we want to move forward with this and really think about and sort of even like critically think about, can IG 2.0 meaningfully and ontologically be integrated with coding interview-based data, right? So what are the pros and cons? What are the things that we should be thinking about in application? And if we can sort of apply it this way, thinking through how the micro level, right, the individual institutional grammar may or may not, or sort of the mechanisms through which, right, micro level institutional grammar can aggregate to how organizations and interorganizational relationships develop, right? And a big piece of this is sort of the logical model of the actor. And so we just want to put this forward as thinking about ways that we are definitely asking for feedback and would love some thought processes around this micro level institutional grammar that presents itself in this interorganizational space. Thanks, Tom.
All right, and thank you, Kate. I also want to echo Kate's appreciation for everyone on this call, and especially the organizers. It sounds like an amazing community that's developing, and we're excited to be kicking off this academic year. I also did want to briefly thank Kate and the folks at UIC, as well as my other collaborators at Northern Illinois University. They have been super outstanding collaborators. If you ever have the chance to work with any of them, I would highly and heartily recommend it. All right, so I'm going to start here just with a slide that shows something that might be familiar to anyone who's kind of been in the Midwest, and this is the Chicago metropolitan area. There's a lot of ways that we can construct this idea of a metropolitan area, but this is roughly the space within which we're working. You could think of this as very roughly our study area, although most of what I'll talk about today is focusing very directly on Chicago and its most immediate suburbs, so what we would think of as the urbanized area. Part of why I'm leading off with this is to get you into the headspace of polycentricity. In the Midwest and in a lot of other places in the United States, there are many, many local governments. And this means that from the perspective of collaboration and collective action, that they have many opportunities when it comes to service delivery to think about who they will be working with and how, and that can also change over time. So we're talking about 435 municipalities in just this relatively small geography here. And that also includes 13 counties, 16 watersheds, and 246 townships. If we're thinking about this as a water system holistically, using the very broad idea of systems, this is clearly something that's complex and imbued with polycentricity, and that's kind of a key part of the foundation of our work, as you'll see. This was an early diagram that we made largely from document review and from some conversations with key stakeholders. I would think of it as a stylized network diagram. So this is not meant to show in a way that might be familiar, like the weight of ties or what's characterizing them. But we do know that there are linkages among different groups that constitute this system. So even though the previous slide was sort of emphasizing municipalities and watersheds, there are a lot of other groups that work in this space as well. Things like watershed coalitions, watershed planning groups, state level actors like Illinois Sierra Club, and as well as some state agencies are in there. Illinois has a lot of special districts. So besides the general purpose local governments, which would be municipalities and counties, we also have special districts that are designed to deliver one specific service. For example, a forest preserve district of Will County, or a metropolitan water reclamation district. And these all can have functions within the water system. So when we're talking about water systems, the two big precursors for the region, the study area that we're looking at, are polycentricity and are also a diverse set of actors who have many interesting and shifting roles over time. Okay, so one thing that we did not fully appreciate the complexity of when we first began on this research project was where can you get your water from, and what are the different ways that that water supply can be governed? I think all of us who maybe have experience in anything to do with service delivery, whether directly or indirectly, that we know it can be kind of complicated, that privatization can be involved, that cooperation using interlocal agreements can be involved. In the water system within this region, it takes that complexity to a new level. So if we think from the perspective of a municipality, this would be a city or a village, for example, there are three source options that they have for where they can get their water from, and this can shift over time. Many started by getting their water through deep water wells that would access aquifers. Some used rivers, and then some draw it directly from Lake Michigan. And there are cities that have shifted, for example, from aquifer to river to lake. And there are others who do like a combination of those things. So they might rely partly on wells and then also supplement that with a river or the lake. And as I've said, that can shift over time. Another key aspect of those is they are all really common pool resources. So if we think back to like what are the characteristics that make a common pool resource, it's something that's exhaustible, right? That it can go away. And so that poses a resource constraint on the local governments that are relying on these. A river can be depleted because it doesn't have enough flow going into it, or it becomes polluted. An aquifer can easily run dry. There's a lot of water drawn out of them, and the replenishment rate from storms is not matching that drawdown. Even Lake Michigan is something that is institutionally a common pool resource. There is a Supreme Court decree that limits the amount of water that can be drawn out of Lake Michigan. So all of these are scarce resources, and that characterizes some of the choices that then have to be made by municipalities. So on one hand, they are responding very much to resource scarcity, and then they are also having to be responsive to trying to figure out which of their neighbors they will work with if they do decide to go that route. So if you look at the left-hand side of this slide, this is a very abstract view of how drinking water specifically can be governed. So even though I've been talking about water systems in kind of a very broad sense, from here forward, it's going to be just about drinking water and how that's supplied. If you look at number one there, that would just be a municipality getting its own water. It might draw it directly from Lake Michigan, a river, an aquifer, as I've said, and then supplying that to its residents. A municipality could also rely on a dyadic interlocal agreement. So this is just a one-to-one match. Maybe a suburb that's bordering Lake Michigan pulls that water in and then supplies it to one of its neighbors through an interlocal agreement. There can also be arrangements where one municipality supplies to many different. So it's not just a one-to-one link, but it's a one-to-many. And then the last example is something that's somewhat unique, at least in our understanding of water systems, both in the US and throughout the world, that you can have multiple municipalities working together, either in a commission or in what's called a joint action water agency, or a JAWA. So if I get too involved with acronyms, I might just spout out JAWA in the rest of this presentation. It means a joint action water agency. So this is formed through reciprocal interlocal agreements. And there's different ways that these organizations can function. And I don't need to unpack that for purposes of this presentation. But they have bylaws. They kind of exist at a level above what we would think of as just the individual municipalities and their agreements. So they very much are like a regional organizing governance structure. So part of what really began to intrigue us early on was, why did some municipalities choose some forms of this over others? And similar to what we saw with the source, where that can evolve over time, that governance choice can evolve. So a lot of municipalities started with direct provision and supply, and then as resources became scarce, for example, their aquifers started to run out, they would have to pursue interlocal agreements. And that's a very interesting decision-making space to us. How do they decide to shift toward collaboration, and why do they do that? I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide. This is just to show you that the abstract view of how I was presenting this in the previous slide does have a real world corollary to it. So if you spend some time looking at this map, and you can see the source, this was done by the Chicago Tribune. I wish we could take credit for this diagram, but we can't. You can see that municipalities, which are listed here, there are the dots that you're seeing. For example, Evanston can directly both have its own water from Lake Michigan, have an interlocal agreement with one other municipality, and then it can also supply water to the Northwest Water Commission. Chicago is the biggest drawer directly, but it also has a role where it supplies to many hundreds of municipalities, either directly or through things like a water commission or a joint action water agency. All right, so as I've said, just as a summary, the choice of both water source and governance arrangement can shift over time. This is something that's a decision made by administrative and/or elected officials in local governments. They're in a highly polycentric, highly institutionalized setting. And so here's where we're going to shift to maybe talking a little bit more about the theory and our research questions behind this. So we're working with this idea of an action arena, which is probably a concept familiar to many of you. And specifically, we're interested in the governance choice action arena and the ways that it is institutionalized. So for those who might not have been exposed to that term, action arena is a conceptual unit. It's comprised of an action situation, which is defined by variables describing things like participants, the positions they have, the outcomes that exist, as well as the actors. So we have an action situation and then actors. And we care about like the rationality that those actors have, their imagination of things, the resources that they bring to the table. So when I invoke that term action arena, I'm talking both about the action situation as well as the actors that are within it. And to link back to the previous slides, we wanted to know why in that action arena did we sometimes see specific governance choices coming out of that and how those were shifting over time. The gap that we'd identified is a need for attention to shared understandings that function as informal, tacit, constitutive institutions that parameterize the governance choice action arena. So I know I'm throwing a lot of words there, but more or less what we're saying is that there is an imagination that individuals have of the situation that they are entering into. And that idea of having an imagination or an institutional logic, if we look, for example, at some of the work that Kate has done in this area, people bring those to the negotiating table. People bring those to their own internal government organizational meetings. And so if we think of these as shared understandings or imaginations, it's not likely that those will have written artifacts, but rather that they will function as informal, tacit institutions. And not just regulative institutions, which are something familiar to many of you, but the actual constitutive institutions that create the parameters for how this action arena functions. So if we translate that gap into a research question, what we're asking is, how does an individual's value of cooperation as a mode of interpersonal and interorganizational relations and the degree to which the action arena is a system and a shared performance paradigm contribute to their proclivity for interlocal cooperation as a governance mode? So we can think of proclivity for interlocal cooperation in some senses like the dependent variable in what we're interested in. And then there's really these three drivers of this that are each an aspect of the imagination that individuals bring. So if we're to unpack a little more that idea of systemicity, performance, and cooperation as the triple paradigms that are being brought into these situations. Just to dig into each of those a little bit. When we say something like cooperation, we're basically distinguishing between individuals who are hierarchs or individualists from those who are egalitarians or communitarians. This gets a little bit into social psychology and how people are with regard to cooperation, that some of us are basically wired to favor things like being more egalitarian or communitarian, and that you can measure this, right? That you can gather evidence of it. Systemicity is the notion that some individuals have much more siloed thinking, while others are able to view things as a holistic transdisciplinary system. And then lastly, the performance paradigm is a piece that very much comes from the performance management literature. The notion that you could have a shared understanding of what it means to perform well. You could have similar metrics, for example, that inspire you or motivate things. You can also have very divergent paradigms. So there's always the difficulty of coming up with a diagram that magically summarizes everything. And we hope that this one kind of reflects our thinking going into this. So you could think of this in a way as our proposition, right? Our proposition is that if individuals have a shared logic in these three dimensions, cooperation, systemicity, and performance, that we should see an increased likelihood of cooperation. You could apply this conceivably to any service delivery question, or and really anything where cooperation is needed across organizations, especially public service organizations. In our case, it's local governments with regard to drinking water. All right, so just digging a bit more into the background theory that's motivating what we're talking about. We're all used to the word institutions. Clearly, I won't dig too much into this. This is pulling from Ostrom, Crawford and Ostrom, the work of North over a few decades, and then Delat quite recently. The sentence that I really want to highlight there is that there is a role for shared understanding of actors as an institution, that it doesn't just have to be all about rules that are written down, but rather that there can be these shared understandings and that they can be tacitly held. So that's going pretty far back in the institutional literature, that notion of shared understandings being a way to think of institutions, even though those don't always get the most attention in the literature. We also wanted to link this really to this notion of interlocal cooperation among local governments. We have a rich history going back several decades of empirical and theoretical work that suggests that the determinants of interlocal cooperation are highly institutional. So this kind of makes sense why in our diagram we're saying shared understandings might matter. That's just in this rich tradition of saying institutions matter. It's a different facet of that. So there's a few foundation pieces that we're pulling from here. Work in network theory, this would be by LaRue and Pandy, Fredrickson, Thurmeyer, and Wood, emphasizes the importance of multiplexity. So that if you have ties in some areas, that you're going to continue to have more ties in other areas, and that multiplexity can apply even to a bridge from informal to formal linkages. So this multiplexity results from reciprocity and other normative and strategic heuristics arising from shared memberships among local government decision makers. This could be epistemic communities, it could be a professional association, lots of ways that those linkages can develop that. A second foundation piece is institutional collective action. Like Carr, LaRue, and Shrestha, Brown, and Petoskey, this is really drawing from the transaction costs economics foundations going back to even the 50s. It emphasizes actors who are functioning as agents of organizations who balance the joint benefits of cooperation against the transaction costs associated with it. There are some similarities, between network and institutional collective action theories. Obviously, interpersonal relationships matter quite a lot in both. It's just that they have different reasons for why that matters. In institutional collective action, it's that it reduces transaction costs. In network theory, it's that it creates reciprocity over time. Interlocal cooperation, we know that's one of many different alternative service delivery modes. And so really, these have been used, network theory and ICA, as a way to understand why you might go it alone, or why you might choose privatization, or why you might choose interlocal cooperation. There's some other explanatory institution. We know that state rules, for example, matter. We saw that in the work of Kruger and Bernick, so laws that exist. We know that trusted intermediaries also matter. Policy entrepreneurs can play an important role here. And so getting this now into the institutional grammar space, and Kate's already talked about this a little, so I'm not going to spend too much time here. We know that institutions can leave written artifacts, but we also know that they're identifiable as rules in use through narrative. And this was in the work of Watkins and Westphal, so that's where I'm pulling this quote from. And we were really inspired by that because we were starting not just with documents, but also getting into interviews pretty early on in our research process. Institutional grammar, as I'm guessing all of you know, is an analytical approach that involves dismantling syntactic components of written and spoken institutions to describe and compare institutional designs and investigate the relationship between institutions and policy outcomes. We really felt the need to turn to institutional grammar because we were finding that there was a lot in the interviews that we did that went beyond just the written documents, the plans, the budgets, what have you, right? Like there's a lot written within these spaces, especially within complex system spaces. But then there were many pieces that were coming out that we would have never been able to find written evidence of. And we wanted a way to more systematically approach it. So what we're hoping all of you can help us with is figuring out whether our system of doing that and our use of institutional grammar makes sense. This is sort of a proof of concept moment for us. So institutional grammar, just to refresh everyone, has constitutive and regulative institutions. I've talked about this a little bit already, but the regulative statements signal implied or explicit agency while specifying duty and discretion or sanctions for transgression, whereas the constitutive statements introduce or parameterize fundamental aspects of the action situation. So we are very much about constitutive statements and understanding how institutional logics or imaginations within the dimensions that we specified earlier. So cooperation, systemicity, and performance paradigms can be reflected as constitutive statements and then parsed. When you parse them, these are the different pieces that you can separate them into. So as I go through some of our interview examples, I will be identifying things as entity or modal or properties or function or context. And you'll be able to see how that kind of maps over from the statements. All right, so just to return to this, so it's sort of fresh in everyone's head. The data collection that we had, I've mentioned that we relied a lot on these semi-structured interviews. These were really quite involved. We usually thought they were going to go about 50 minutes or so, and they tended to go well beyond that. And Kate and Jason were very helpful in this process, and we got a lot of fantastic information out of this. So for those qualitative interviewers on the call today, qualitative work is awesome, and it's very exciting. It revealed a lot to us about things that we could have never gleaned in other ways. Our goal with these interviews was functional completion. So each of these organizations has a very distinct and at least superficially unique role within the system. Our goal was to maximize heterogeneity in those shared understandings that we're talking about. So we really wanted to get folks who we thought might have distinct cooperation or performance or systemicity paradigms as we were working through this. All right, so to highlight one of our dimensions first, cooperation, I'll always present this as the institutional statement on the left and then the institutional grammar application on the right. And then at the bottom, I sort of give two ends of the spectrum. So communitarian, if you remember, was at the center of our diagram, and then individualist was on the outside. So the institutional statement, the beauty of the task force is that it brings all of those communities and organizations together to discuss water issues, and from all those different perspectives. So this was an example of the entities being identified as a constitutive statement would, the functions, which would be discussion together, and then the context, which would be water issues as an activation condition specifically here. If we look at the next statement, how do we make a sustainable environment? It falls back onto the municipality. What's cost effective for you? We're facing some issues. We're one of the largest communities in the state. That suggests a very different imagination than the first statement, right? The first one is about coming together to discuss issues. The second is very much about the entity being just a municipality acting alone, functionally making decisions alone, with the broader context of pursuing a sustainable environment. So this is just one example, but as we went through our interviews, we found many moments where we could code things distinctly in this way. And the institutional grammar was actually helpful to us in trying to parse some of these statements out. So here we're parsing them into entities, functions, and context. If we shift to another dimension here, this is the systemicity dimension. which ranges from high to low systemicity, people who are very much transdisciplinary versus ones who might be much more siloed in their thinking. So an example of a high systemicity statement would be, I think about the imposition that people have made on the movement of water through life in a way that is advantageous in some way for some group of people and potentially for other aspects of the ecology like wildlife. So here the entities being brought in even go so far as including life and wildlife. The context here, this was universal, so this wasn't really applicable as having like a specific context where this would be parameterizing the action arena. The indicators that we have are ecological, unified, large scale. By contrast, the second statement is what we would think of as low systemicity. They do mention the system, but they really only mention the municipality as the thing comprising that system. It has a very narrow function to provide drinking water. And so this idea of being functional, fragmented, and small scale really seemed like a low systemicity statement to us. And I want to emphasize that some of the statements that we encountered, if an individual was really talking at length about how they function, they might be hitting on both like the cooperation and the systemicity piece at once in their statement. So it was possible that pieces of this would kind of be coming out in a single answer to a question. And then a final example from performance, and I'll give a couple pieces here. So this is one very long quote. This was from the perspective of someone who was describing how they'd gone through the process of decision-making about which way they would govern their water system. They've looked at CLC JAWA, the Joint Action Water Agency. They've done an in-depth analysis, hired consultants. I went to the board meeting that night along with our executive director, so you can see entities being shown here. And then this statement, do your homework, sharpen your pencils. It's not going to be inexpensive. And a discussion of generations being involved, that it's not just a short-term cost, but it could positively affect your community long-term. The performance paradigm, this was from Hernandez's work on performance. We characterize that as entrepreneurial and strategic. The institutional grammar piece here was identifying both the entities and the functions of those entities being in-depth analysis, evaluation of costs. And then reflecting a more bureaucratic performance paradigm, you can see a discussion of the relationship with the state agency and a real emphasis on that local state relationship. This is very much focused on permitting and process and emphasize compliance and being wary of the Supreme Court decree that was in place. So the broader idea, taking all of these together, is that when you have individuals within a negotiated decision-making space where they're considering cooperating with each other, if everyone agreed, if everyone had the same bureaucratic performance paradigm and were very individualistic in how they were thinking of things, or were very communitarian rather in how they were thinking through things and had systems thinking, because they had a shared paradigm, had that systems perspective, and were working from a communitarian perspective, we would expect that that negotiated decision-making would result in interlocal cooperation. So we're at the stage where we don't have the evidence quite to test that, and Kate's going to now talk a little bit about what the next steps are in this research.
Great, thanks, Tom. So yeah, just kind of circling back and thinking about where we love guidance and feedback. We have this really rich data generated from these interviews, and we're thinking kind of our next steps. And so while there are some documents that exist that are kind of this planning space around sort of saying, these are the next 5-year plans, or setting out sort of messaging about the nature of decision-making for water governance, we recognize those don't fit quite neatly or as neatly as specifically policy documents. But we do have the opportunity to sort of look at what's being communicated and compare what we can code, thinking from an IG 2.0 perspective, from the written versus the interview data, and sort of lead us to think about what sorts of things are translated more into a written form versus sort of the way individuals at the micro level are describing what they do at a macro level, right, for this intergovernmental or interorganizational collaboration. So we are currently in our project moving on also to a survey of local government officials to better understand and sort of more broadly get a picture of their understandings of cooperation, systemicity, and performance. And we hope to integrate some of what we learned from that as well. And also really thinking critically about defining the boundaries of our governance choice action arena. Because within at least the context of Northeastern Illinois, with these hundreds of municipalities, there's lots of options for municipalities to choose how to basically choose how to purchase or how to get access to drinking water. And this changes over time. So there is an opportunity more broadly in our research agenda to think about, changes over time and what might be triggering those changes from an institutional perspective. And so we just want to kind of leave you all with some of our key questions for future research, recognizing we're also hoping for feedback as we think about kind of how to move this forward. So one of the things we're really interested in is, what is the threshold or sort of the accumulation, like when is there a tipping point of shared understanding among actors that leads to cooperation, right? So how can we look at what's being shared in written documents as well as the interview data to start to understand sort of this accrual of understanding, and how when institutional grammars start to have patterns that may be similar, can we look at that from the perspective of sort of accumulating a better understanding that can lead to collaborative governance or your cooperation engagement, right? And part of that is the temporal. So how long does it take for accumulation of shared understanding? Also, how does this variation in really the constitutive institutions relate to choices that municipalities are making? Some of my past research, and I know a goal of this team, is actually looking at the tensions that get navigated in institutional choice, and then how those, what might be a reason for a municipality to say, no, we're just going to do it on our own, and is there something that from a policy perspective can help us kind of almost see through the statements of an organization, a municipality, that their grammar is really leading towards more of a, or is leading towards a different type of understanding of how they're going to cooperate than others, and what might that mean? And also this place of sort of relating to that first question, how do we aggregate this sort of tacit constitutive institutions, right? So when there's discussion about governance, how we're going to make decisions to cooperate or not cooperate, being able to really trace how that then like accumulates into formal regulative institutions. So what is the process through which sort of almost this, right, the laboratory of polycentricity, if you will, then leads to more formal regulative institutions that create order out of lots of actors. So we really appreciate your time. We wanted to leave it with just sort of a few questions on our research agenda, and we hope to get feedback over the next few minutes. So thanks to everyone.
Great, thank you so much, Thomas and Kate. Any questions, comments? I can kick us off while we're waiting for people to chime in here, I guess. So Kate and Thomas, I admire that you've taken on the difficult task of trying to process interview data with the grammar, because that is significantly more challenging than coding very structured policy mandates, for example. I guess part of me, when I was looking at the coding, was wondering if there might be some additional steps that you would entertain to guide the coding. There were some coding fields that some coding that I might have handled differently, but I also recognize that I don't have as much of an understanding of the context. So that's my kind of high level sense on that. But I wonder, in sort of mapping out doing the coding, if when you're dealing with interview data, if it could be useful to kind of structure your context a little bit more before doing the coding. And perhaps this is what you did. So for example, like identifying, in these action situations, what are the kinds of parameterization that would happen in the context of the action situations that you're looking at, or what types of activities do you intend to see? Is it like information communication? Is it, aggregate kind of collective decision making? Is it, what is it exactly? And then that could sort of be used as a guide in the coding. Like then when you get to the coding and you're looking at entities, then that could clue you into like, these are the types of entities I'm generally looking for. And this sort of thing is in or out for. Similar on the regulative coding side, like these are the activities that I'm thinking about. These are the kinds of actors whose activities I'm interested in capturing, and then sort of using that as a reference point in the coding. And I guess I just say this like, because otherwise it's very inductive in like interview data, and then sort of applying the grammar and like kind of reconstructing an action situation from basically like these micro elements of statements, whereas that are not even following a specific kind of structure. So that's like a very, very challenging thing. Whereas if you kind of go in with some sense of like, well, what structures you're expecting, what kind of parameters expecting, that might offer some contextualization. Anyway, I don't know if that makes any sense. And maybe that was your process, in fact. And part of me, again, is just really grateful that you're taking on this challenge so that you can tell us what to do when we try to do it.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little, and then I have a feeling Kate will have some really good insights, honestly, on this. So with one of the dimensions we had, which was the performance paradigm piece, there were specific interview questions that we're trying to get at, like, how do you think about performance? So you can almost say like the interviewee was in the headspace, at least, of like imagining themselves in the performance action arena, right? Like, oh, if I'm making decisions about what performance means, then this is what I will speak to in my answer. With some of the other pieces, it was a little trickier. So like the cooperation one, the challenge of the interview was you don't want to bias them into seeming individualistic or cooperative, for example, right? So we did notice that most of the things where they were talking in those terms were with early interview questions we had about like, describe the water system to us. So like, what does it look like? We had an early moment too, where we showed them the diagram that we gave you earlier with all the different circles and squares and stuff on it, and then said like, okay, who else needs to be in this? So like we sort of extremely made it very sparse, right? Institutionally sparse. We put only a few organizations and said, who else needs to be in here? So I guess the tricky thing about the interviews, at least to me, was we were wrestling with the tension of how to ask them directly about an action situation and get all the details on that, while also wanting to be sort of almost agnostic enough that we didn't seem like we cared whether they were speaking in individualistic or cooperative terms, or that they were going in a bureaucratic or an entrepreneurial direction with their performance paradigm. So it was really a tension, like how do we get them to talk about action situations and action and that arena as a whole and the other actors in it without just guiding them along toward it. But I think you make a really good point that, especially as we're trying to be more systematic in our approach to the coding, we would need to step back ourselves and think, okay, what was the person actually talking about in this moment, so that we're not just or else we could sort of get the data to say whatever we wanted, honestly, which is always a risk, I think, on some of these things. So, Kate, did you have any?
Oh.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if it makes sense in your context, so, feel free to say that it doesn't, but, a lot of times, like when we go into coding with the grammar, it's like, we'll code at the micro level and then we'll use it as a basis for then doing like rule type coding or something. And I almost wonder if the opposite might be helpful in your case, like, okay, these are these action situations in this polycentric arrangement that you're observing, and you take these kind of statements and identify, like, for each action situation, like, here's some information rules, here are some, position rules, all the different rule types. And then, I mean, I don't know, I just wonder if, or even before you classify individual information as rules, just sort of flagging like, well, this is the kind of information, or this is the kind of like aggregation I expect to see. And that can help in sort of deciphering and negotiating like the coding, I guess. I don't know.
Like, that's kind of making sense.
Yeah, and this is really helpful. So absolutely, one of the things that sort of like when we posed the question of sort of thinking about from an individual, like it's an individual's statements, right? So I think to your question about defining the action arenas, one of the processes is that within this polycentric thing, there really are 4 sorts of options, right? Of buy your own drinking water, buy it or provide your own drinking water to your municipality, buy it from someone else, buy it from someone else in a collective agreement, or as a group of communities band together to then get your drinking water. And so I think that some of what you're talking about, Saba, could really help us in thinking about the what are the distinguishing factors between those cooperative types, and from that helping us to think through the rules or rule types that people are discussing that would align with those different cooperative types.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really, I think, interesting. It's almost like thinking about how you're going to operationalize the differences in the decision making that you're trying to characterize. And I think too, like insofar as you are comparing across, it would be useful to have some structure, like think about it in terms of a structure that will allow you to do that kind of comparison too. I don't know. Adam? Sorry, Adam, I took too much time.
Oh no, this is good. I'm gonna forward everything that y'all mentioned to Aaron, because we've been going through the exact same conversations these past 2 weeks about how to extract institutional information from the interviews that we've gathered with municipal water system. And we seem to be veering more towards the route that Saba described of finding action situations and then characterizing the rules within those spaces. But the work that they were doing was much more focusing in on the city rather than looking at interlocal arrangements. So they look at kind of what is the rate-making action situation within the city, rather than the choice to form an interlocal service delivery agreement. But yeah, I wanted to say I was really excited by this presentation because I think it has some good synergies with the work that we're doing here at ASU. And I definitely echo Saba's sentiment about thank you for beginning the journey for teaching us how to code interviews. But I have many questions that are swirling around in my head right now, so I'm just going to focus on one for now. When you talk about polycentricity and cooperation, inevitably what comes first to my mind is externalities from cooperation in the polycentric network. So you have kind of your framework of the 3 mindsets, I guess, or attitudes of the individual and how that affects their cooperative proclivity, I guess. But I think the big question mark there in my mind is how do past cooperative activities or existing cooperative activities affect that decision from both a positive and a negative sense, right? Because in one sense, you can have kind of a budget of your cooperative attention that could be negatively affected by existing cooperative activities, or it could be a positive sense where you have a good experience of cooperation, so you want to engage in more cooperation. So I was wondering, I guess, how that factor of externalities or the ecology of games, if you will, factors in here.
That is a really good question. I'm also always relieved to hear anybody say like, this connects to the work that we're doing in the space. I know a lot of folks are kind of working in the water, I guess the drinking water space, especially in water systems in general, but that there's also people wrestling with this from an IG perspective is really useful to know. I'll give my attempt at an answer, and then I'll have Kate, and Jason's on this call too if he wants to chime in. I think that's a really good point, and what I'm thinking about especially is that cooperation dimension that we had as one of the three in our diagram. So it was systemicity, performance, and cooperation. I do wonder if there's almost too much loading on it, either too much or not enough loading sort of on that cooperation dimension, because a lot of my own work is like, it privileges the individual perspective and what their rationality is. And it does that distinction between hierarch and egalitarian, individual and communitarian. I think there's probably some pieces being lost there. So like the externalities piece, the idea of like your reciprocity norms and some of that, there might be a way to maybe take that dimension, or like a theoretically compelling reason to maybe separate that out into a couple different pieces, because there's really like the individual rationality of cooperation that we have, and then there's, as you described it, like the budget, right? The transaction cost piece, if you wanted to say it that way, or even in network theory, be the reciprocity piece. So I think there's room to maybe have a little more nuance to what's being loaded onto the cooperation dimension right now. And that also, frankly, might make it easier to do some of the coding as we're going through this. That one little piece, and I don't know if it ties to this, but because we aimed for functional completion with the interviews, something that Kate had mentioned back a couple months and that I think we'd benefit from, and it sort of is motivating the survey work, is it means that we don't have multiple interviews from individuals within like a similar context, right? So like it would help probably a lot to have more data from individuals who pursued like the Jawa option, and then see what the coding looks like as we're gathering from across there, instead of just relying on functional completion. So I think maybe those two pieces will be an improvement, like looking at that cooperation dimension a little more, and then getting data from beyond just this attempt at functional completion. Kate, do you have any?
I second all that. Absolutely. I would say absolutely. Teamwork makes the dream work. But I would also say that in other research also that I've been engaged in right now is actually from the really like the budget focused side of how water rates are set. So it's not the governance of how we engage as communities, but the getting more to the, how are they actually monetizing transaction costs of how they're going to engage with water purchasing or water arrangements. So all that to say is there's a lot more there that probably in about a year we would have a lot to say about and really think about the trade-offs that are actually being weighed in these decisions from a more not traditional, but just from a more budgetary transaction cost perspective.
Tomas, if we have time, I think we do.
Yep,
right?
I think we can take Tomas as our final question.
All right, I'm going to make it short. Well, first of all, thank you both, Thomas and Kate. I think it's really cool what you're all doing. And in fact, it's something that I'm actually struggling at the time, trying to see how to analyze interview data. So I think what you're doing is pretty neat. I just have a quick question because I have been sort of dealing with this as well. And I'm wondering, the point that you were making, Thomas, about just the interviews have been focused mainly on functional completion, right? And you're only been getting one representative from one organization. Since you're dealing with organizations that are making these decisions about, say, whether or not to join a JAWA, I wonder if there is a possibility of tapping onto written records, such as meeting minutes, for instance, of these organizations, so that you can get at what those discussions have been at the time of making that decision, and then also so that you can get at that overtime component that Kate was mentioning earlier. Just a question to see if you have been thinking about that, and if so, how?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll jump,
Go ahead.
I can jump in on this one too. Yes, yes, many times yes. I will say there's two challenges. One is that depending upon the municipality and when they made a decision to join or not join a commission JAWA, they may not have great records about it. And at least the 10 most prominent JAWAs in the Northeastern Illinois region range from, we have a lot of information about what we do, to you're going to have to show up at our offices to ask us actual questions. So the answer is yes, and that's a big part of our future research, is to gather more primary documents that can help us untangle some of that. And because of functional completion, of sort of thinking about like trying to figure out the actors inclusive, there's not a lot of great record keeping on some of this. Different states have different regulations about how much needs to be kept track of. Unfortunately, here it's a little bit up to the municipality or commission.
Yeah.
So we're working on collecting, but it's not a great list of having completion there.
There was nothing in the state laws authorizing commissions and JAWAs requiring great record keeping at all, really. So it's a little frustrating, because it does mean, one, it limits some of the ability to see how the tacit understandings translate into formal, like how that pathway from tacit understanding to bylaw adoption, right? Like there's a lot of gaps in there for some of the places we're looking at. I guess the one thing that does help us a little is these choices are still being made. So the water allocation from Lake Michigan is shrinking all the time, and it's recently had like a very large city decide to switch to Lake Michigan water. So there are kind of ongoing processes that we're hoping we can gather better evidence about, rather than the ones from the 1990s. And so cautious optimism on that front, that we'll at least have some processes that are relatively gap free. But right now, that pathway from informal to formal on the constitutive statements is just, it's really tricky. It's, if only there were evidence of everything that you wanted to get, but we do have interviews that we can access, and hopefully we can rely on some documents and not just on people's memories for this. So.
Great. Well, that brings us to the end of our time together, but Kate and Thomas and Jason, I'd be happy to continue the conversation with you on the coding, if you think that could be helpful.
Yes, very much.
Give you more specific feedback on some of the coding that you showed, and others if you'd like. But in any case, thank you so much again for taking the time to be with us today, and we'll see you all in about a month for our next IGRI seminar. And to that point, we do have some open slots for this upcoming year. So if you have some work that you're doing that you would like to share with the group, please just feel free to reach out, and we'll find you a slot on the schedule. So.
And Kate shared her email address in the chat. So anyone wants to contact either of us, really, it's fine. It would be very welcome. And Saba, I really appreciate your offer, and we will probably take you up on that. I think we would love that.
Awesome. All right. Well, everybody have a wonderful rest of your day, however long that is, and we'll see you soon. Bye.
Thanks again, Saba. Take care.
Yep. Thanks. Bye-bye.